Palestinian culture is beautiful by virtue of the people that choose over and over again to celebrate it and preserve it and live it in a way that keeps it alive despite every force that's trying to ensure that it doesn't live.
Welcome to the Passing Through podcast, a show dedicated to exploring those spaces not just within, but also between and around us. The cracks in the walls, the moments between the moments. I speak with thinkers, authors, artists, teachers, and everyday humans who have touched the edge of the ordinary and found something to bring back. Welcome back to the Passing Through podcast. This is a special episode. It's another episode in a series of episodes intended to raise awareness about what's happening in Palestine and support Palestinian resistance. It's been over 600 days since October 7th and 77 years since the Nakba. Right now, malnourished Palestinians are unable to receive medical treatment because most of Gaza's hospitals and clinics have been obliterated. Between 70 and 80% of all buildings in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed by Israeli forces. Israel has imposed a blockade to prevent much-needed aid from entering Gaza, creating a famine. Millions are at risk of starvation. 89% of Gaza's water and sanitation infrastructure has been partially or completely destroyed. Human beings in Gaza are facing annihilation while the world watches from their smartphones. These are all chilling facts, but facts don't generally change people's minds. Stories might, though, or at least that's my hope. And this week, I have a real human sharing real stories. This week, Moureen Kaki joins us live from a war zone in Gaza. When our governments fail to step up and intervene on behalf of a persecuted people, individual humans and communities do. Moureen is one of those. She's a Palestinian American who left her home in Texas to work on the ground in Gaza, providing humanitarian aid to Palestinians suffering from starvation and genocide. For nearly a year, she's been partnering with organizations like Glia International and Shabab Gaza to make a real impact by providing medical aid as well as food to a population under ethnic cleansing. We talk about her time providing aid in Palestine, her life in Gaza, community and belonging, finding beauty amongst the rubble, and the tenacity of the Palestinian soul. All of the links you need to support Moureen and the organizations she works with will be in the show notes. As always, be good to one another, and let's jump in. So, Moureen, welcome to the Passing Through podcast. It is an honor to have you here.
Hey, Danny, thanks so much for having me on. I appreciate you.
So, lots of people I speak to back home in the US and also here in Europe, they have kind of grown distrustful of the media, particularly Western news media, which primarily functions as a kind of propagandist arm for coloniality and empire, manufacturing consent by dehumanizing Palestinians and shielding Israel from criticism. This is why I'm really glad to speak to you, because you are someone who is literally on the ground in Gaza. And you're not only on the ground in Gaza, but you're providing relief to people under desperate and obscene circumstances, people under state-sanctioned famine and genocide. And you did all of this. You left your home in Texas to go to Gaza and provide this humanitarian aid. And you've from my understanding, you've cooked hundreds of thousands of meals. You're going into places that other aid workers and humanitarian groups are afraid to go to. So, the first thing I want to do before we even jump into anything is just thank you for all of the incredible service that you're doing there on the ground.
I really appreciate that. It feels weird to get thanked for this kind of stuff, to be honest with you, because it feels more of like an honor to be able to get to participate and be at all useful in this situation. Because for the first several months of the genocide, when I was just sort of watching from my phone, like most others who aren't in Gaza, it was really stressful and horrible. And it's not any less stressful or horrible here, of course, because the same things are happening to people that don't deserve them, and they're just as horrific. But it feels, it's nice to feel useful in some part. And even that is kind of a bit of a stretch, right? The people that are here don't actually need me to be here. They would be doing all of this work if I weren't here. I'm just privileged to be able to get to help in that sense. But I appreciate the sentiment of what you're saying very much. Thank you.
Can you actually tell us a bit of the story of how you got there, how you went from watching it on your phone to actually being there and being a part of all of this?
Sure, yeah. It's a funny story, actually. I first joined a Glia delegation in March of 2024, and it was supposed to be 2 weeks, but there was a mix-up in the rotation, and we were delayed by a couple days. So it ended up being a 12-day rotation with a medical mission of 10 doctors and another logistics person. And I honestly, I fell in love with Gaza. And, I've been to other parts of Palestine. My family's from the West Bank, and so I've lived in the West Bank. I got to visit what we call 48, occupied Palestine, quote unquote, the state of Israel. And it's beautiful, but Gaza was always the one place in Palestine that I couldn't go, right? So it was really unfortunate that I only got the opportunity to come in the middle of a genocide, but still, I was grateful to be here. And even then, you could still see the beauty of the place and its people, even under this horrific context. And so, I didn't want to leave on my first trip, but I had to for work reasons. So then the Rafah border closed. Rafah border closed, I believe, May 1st of 2024. And the Rafah border closed, and I was contacted by Glia, one of their Glia admins, and they were like, "Hey, would you be interested in going back to Gaza potentially for a longer time? Because this is something we talked about before." And I didn't really hesitate, I gotta say. I got the call from Glia's medical director on a Wednesday morning, and his question to me was, "How quickly can you get to Cairo?" Because that's where we thought we were going to enter from. And I told him, I have my brother's graduation this Thursday and Friday, so I can be there Saturday. And sure enough, call came in on Wednesday. I booked a flight for Saturday morning, and even got my passport renewed in the process because it was going to expire. And Israel's one of those places where you have to have it valid for 6 months. And so, yeah, I made it to Cairo. I quit my job. I was working for a Palestinian American NGO at the time, and I quit my job with them and came with Glia, knowing that I was going to stay pretty long term. Not exactly sure how long. I had in mind a year, and now I've been here for a year shy of like 5 days, and I still don't want to leave yet. So yeah, it was pretty wild. It was a wild opportunity, especially because the Rafah border closed, and we weren't sure when they would be letting in delegations again. And I had ended up having to wait in Cairo for 2 weeks, and then the plan changed, and we had to then come in through Amman and cross in from the Jordanian, what should be the Jordanian-Palestinian border, but is essentially an Israeli-run border. Um, and the Israelis were facilitating the humanitarian rotations that way. So yeah, that's the story of how I got in, and I have not left since. I came in on June 6th of 2024.
Wow. So you've been there for a year providing aid, and have your responsibilities been split between Glia and the food work? Because I guess Glia is primarily medical support.
Correct, yeah. Glia is primarily medical support. They do a lot of wonderful work, and not just in Gaza, but their work in Gaza in this particular context now is primarily twofold. One is that we run a local polyclinic where we hire local doctors attending to people's, like, it's just sort of like multiple specialties of physicians that rotate throughout the week to give people the care they need. because hospitals have either been bombed or shut down or evacuated or a combination of all of the above, or they're just not accessible, right? Because there's no fuel, there's no transportation. So people that need like sort of basic medical care can't get to a point. So that's one of the things that Glia does. What I'm responsible for is the international side of things, because the other part of Glia's work is to bring in international healthcare workers to work in hospitals and clinics here in Gaza and support the local overworked staff here. And so my responsibility is as head of mission, which is sort of just sorting out the logistics for the doctors, getting them into place, managing their transportation, any issues that come up, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's incredible that you are involved in all of these roles, providing aid on kind of all fronts to people there. That's really, really touching for me. Like, and how did you get involved in the food work?
So the food work's a bit of a funny story. I had met the folks from Shabab Gaza, who is the mutual aid organization that I work with. I had met them on my first trip to Gaza when we were in Rafah and they were in Rafah. And I was just really touched by their work and the story. The founder is somebody named Mohammed Abu Rujala, and he was a really inspiring person, right? He's from East Khan Yunis in southern Gaza, and from like the first week or two of the genocide, he was part of an initiative. He was the founder of an initiative that was out like feeding people in the streets. And this was back before the situation got really dire, right? And as the situation got progressively worse, their work increased at the same time, right? And so it turned into like a very efficiently run grassroots organization that at one point, when they had the capacity, were operating up to 10 kitchens, right? So it was really cool, and I was just really touched by it. And I came in through Glia, and of course I think the medical work is necessary, and I'm happy to do that work. I really am. But there's also a lot of downtime with it because the Israelis are not letting people in, right? So when we try to get doctors in, we try to get healthcare workers in, we get denials. Out of the past six healthcare workers that Glia has applied for entry and have been approved by the WHO, five of them have been denied by the Israelis, and they don't give a reason, right? And there usually isn't a valid reason. They just deny them, and so that creates a bit of downtime for me in that org. And so Glia was okay with me working with this mutual aid group, Shabab Gaza. And I think you know this about me is that I have a food background. And before I left for Gaza, I was running a Palestinian, sort of Palestinian Texan food pop-up called Saha. And I talked about that with Shabab Gaza, and they invited me to cook with them. And little by little, I got more involved in their work because, I just think it's really cool and a wonderful opportunity.
Hmm. Yeah, because one thing is the medical crisis where there aren't enough medical supplies, there aren't enough facilities, there isn't enough transport, the capacity is over 100%. But the other thing is the food crisis that's happening in Gaza right now that's been manufactured by Israel because they've been blocking aid. Can you describe what it's like there? Because for a lot of people, as I mentioned before, the information that they get is from mainstream media outlets generally. But from someone who's down there on the ground, can you describe what the situation is like? Because the first question that I have is, if Israel is blocking food, how do you give food to people? This this sounds like a huge problem if you are there trying to provide humanitarian aid in the form of food. So what do you do when there's a blockade? How do you feed people?
It's a great question, and I appreciate the question because I haven't seen a really nuanced take, and I certainly don't expect that from, Western media outlets. But even in general, I haven't seen a really nuanced take of the food situation. And I guess the short answer is you don't, right? The community kitchens have come to a halt, right? They're producing about a quarter of what they were producing when aid was coming in. And so this is answerable in a few ways. When the border was open during the ceasefire period, some stuff came in, right? And this is no different than any other place in the world, right? There are some people that are going to sort of turn a crisis into an opportunity. And it's true that there are some people that are, selling goods for exorbitant prices, but those exorbitant prices are also driven by the scarcity of material, right? And so and this is getting less and less true. People have to understand as the blockade carries on, because there's still a blockade. 200 trucks in a week is not even a minuscule drop in the ocean of need here. And so it's still a de facto blockade, and this is getting less true, but the reality is that there was some food still available even after the border closed. It was just astronomically high prices, right? The same kilo of potatoes that you used to be able to get, like 3 kilos for $2, $2.50, is now a kilo for close to $20, right? I mean, that's just insane. And those are potatoes. Those are something that are grown in Gaza. So there is some produce still being grown here, and that's less true with the more recent evacuation orders, because the recent evacuation orders were issued north, east, and south mostly as they're closing in on the coast, if you can kind of visualize that. And north, east, and south is actually where Gaza's most productive farmlands are. And so I don't think that's a coincidence. So it's affected crops, right? Like people who planted in the fall or in the winter or whatever were issued evacuation orders and either can't harvest their crops or do so under the constant threat of to their own lives, right? So produce is slightly available, but it's just exorbitant and unaffordable. And you have to realize people haven't worked in a year and a half, right? So there's nobody's walking around with money in their pocket, really. WFP, which is the World Food Program, their warehouses ran out of stock. I think it's been like three or 4 weeks ago now. And so it's just people have been picking up what they can for exorbitant prices on the black market. And I mean, it's crazy, right? When you talk about the black market, we're talking about like rice and dried beans and like sunflower oil to cook in. And yeah, that's how they make it happen. But even then, that's coming to a very quick halt because even at exorbitant prices, there's no longer stuff available to buy.
That's so much more dystopian than I initially imagined because I'm aware of what you're saying, but short of the black market stuff, but also the concept that much of the agricultural land, even though it has been unworked, has been destroyed by the bombings, by deliberate destruction, by contamination from chemicals that are in the explosives and the munitions. So that's one part of the concerted effort to starve the population is by kind of poisoning the land, scorching it, having people evacuate. And then the other part is blocking the aid. And like the number that I saw recently was something like 71,000 children under the age of 5 are facing malnutrition right now. This
Hmm.
is it's horrific to think about this.
Hmm. Yeah, it really is. And malnutrition numbers, this is data from WHO and its partners. Malnutrition numbers have jumped quite significantly since February, right? When there was a ceasefire period, there was a decline in malnutrition because supplies, nutrition, supplements, food were getting in, and now they aren't. And malnutrition deaths have increased, starvation risk has increased. It's just across the board, right? This is all in line for anybody who like has an inkling of a doubt of Israel's like sort of intentional chokehold on all fronts. This is all in line with the policy. Like there's a whole ocean here, right, that should be able to feed this entire population. But that's also been rendered inaccessible even prior to the beginning of this genocide, because Israel only allows Gaza's fishermen to fish like up to I forgot what the exact number was, but it's only a couple kilometers out from the coast, right? And even then, nowadays, you can see the Navy ships of the Israeli military on the coast, and they get quite close sometimes, and they'll shoot at fishermen that are just trying to make a catch, right? So you can imagine that the coast is immediately accessible is overfished because that's all they've been given access to. And again, they're still trying to obtain what they can just because there's no other option, and they're doing so at the risk of getting killed, which has happened numerous times, both prior to this genocide. Of course, there's been an increase since it started in October of 2023.
Yeah. That gives me visuals also of just headlines I've been reading and clips I've been seeing of the Israelis opening fire and massacring the people trying to get food once things were trickling in, once aid started to slowly come in, and as you said, like a drop in the bucket. But the people that were coming in desperate need of this are just getting gunned down, much like these fishermen out at sea trying to find food. It's crazy to think that people are just getting attacked everywhere, anywhere they're trying to get food.
Yeah, it's truly disgusting. And the scenes of the first attack of the people trying to retrieve aid in Rafah, that just it just there's no way that anybody with any like modicum of knowledge on the ground wouldn't have anticipated that, right? That people were going to swarm out of desperation because they're just so hungry. And it's also just like this humiliating, undignified mode of aid distribution and for crumbs at the end of it, right? And so it's hard to believe that this wasn't all intentional from the get-go. And again, this is just another example of Israel targeting aid sites, right? We've heard of the flour massacre. There's been the bakery massacres. There's been all sorts of like targetings of community kitchens themselves. So, I mean, there's been multiple instances of the Israeli military firing at people trying just to get food, right? That's it.
Earlier in the conversation, you mentioned that the people there don't really need you, which is an interesting thing to think about. That, yeah, sure, people in a place will come together, they will find community, they will find solidarity, and they will try to help one another. What is that like there from your perspective? Because I guess you're in a unique position because you are a Palestinian American. So when you're there, you maybe are perceived as an outsider. How is that? Are you welcomed? Are you, yeah, I'm curious what it's like, your sense of belonging there, and what the sense of community is like, and how people are functioning despite what's happening.
That's a really thoughtful question. Thanks. Um, Yeah, it's a bit twofold. It's actually quite funny because in multiple instances, people like just by looking at me, right? I very much dress like a Westerner, and especially because of the gender, right? The gender expectations. The genocide has made even gender roles more conservative, right? I've met several young women, for example, who weren't wearing head covers before the genocide began, but now are doing it just to like avoid attention in general because the circumstances are so horrible that it just it feels like the right move to them, right? So that's just the context for what I'm about to elaborate on, which is of course that because I look Western and I'm a woman who's not wearing a headscarf and I wear jeans, people are usually, they automatically assume that I'm not an Arabic speaker, right? And in more than one case, I'll hear people asking themselves, is she a hostage? So I've had pretty good laughs at that, and then I love answering in Arabic, and they're like, "Oh my God, not only are you not like an Arabic speaker, but you're also your accent sounds like pretty Palestinian. Where's it from?" And my accent is pretty actually distinctly rural West Bank, right? We have a very particular accent that is recognizable, and so for people who know it, they're like, "Oh, you're from Ramallah in the West Bank, right?" And I'm like, "Yes." And so, I gotta say, by and large. I grew up in Texas for pretty much most of my life, and for all of its faults, I love Texas. I love the community that I built there. But one thing that I will say is I was talking to my mom about this. There's just this constant like not fear, it's just this constant paranoia, right? When you're going into a place and you're wearing a kufiya or you've got your Palestine necklace on, it's like, especially after the genocide began and people started actually like realizing what Palestine was, you would have this like paranoia or like fear that somebody would come at you or just, tell you stuff that they've told me before, which is like, go back to where you came from. And I'm like, I wish I could. Um, that slowly just sort of weighs on you as a person, right? To know that like you're like, hey, I'm from this community. I've grown up here. I live here. I work here. I'm friends with the people in this restaurant industry. I've worked with these NGOs, and yet to know that anybody could turn their back on you at any moment because you're Palestinian and they believe you to be like some sort of like terrorist or whatever, and have this really uneducated, really racialized stereotype of you is constantly unsettling. No matter how much community you find in that place, you'll always feel unsettled by that, right? And here I don't have that. And I actually didn't realize how like stressful that load was until I lived in this place as an adult and didn't have to feel it. And it wasn't until like 3 months into my time in Gaza here was I telling my mom that I'm like, I feel so relieved by not having to deal with people's racism in that sense, right? Even if people consider me an outsider here because of the way I dress or the way I talk or the fact that I don't wear a hijab, right? That'll never feel nearly as like stressful or debilitating as the racism that I've endured as a Palestinian who's very much like white adjacent, right? Like I could pass easily for a white person in the US. And so my experiences with racism aren't nearly that of like, darker skinned folks or like black people, for example. It's still a stress that like weighs on you, right? So the community here has been really wonderful. And I've even gotten questions from people that are like, I see you mostly cook in a kitchen with men. How's the sexism, right? They just assume there's this like sort of sexism, and it's true, right? Sexism exists everywhere in the world, and Palestine is no exception. But the United States and Western culture are also not an exception. But I will say that the kitchens that I've worked in with Shabab Gaza, I've actually been more respected than the kitchens I've worked in the US, for my gender,
Wow.
right? Like the guys here are really wonderful, and they're really caring, and they're just downright respectful, right? And sometimes you'll get this odd little kid who like giggles because he sees a grown woman working with men and isn't wearing a headscarf, and the elders, the men that I work with in the kitchen, will set him straight really quick, right, about like being respectful towards me. So the sense of community here has been wonderful. Honestly, I there was a time in November when I thought I might have to leave due to some family issues, and when the thought of leaving was like genuinely heartbreaking, because these people have made me feel at home in a way that is really is really weird, because I consider Palestine my home, I consider Texas my home, but I never thought I would be able to fathom considering Gaza in a way home too, right? And in my year here, it's felt more like home for all the reasons that I just mentioned, and to be able to experience it in this particular moment in history is both sad, but also again oddly very much a privilege as a Palestinian in the diaspora.
Thank you for that. That's a beautiful story. That's very touching. That's nice to hear, and it evokes a question of your other home. And how is it for your mom with you over there and the rest of your family? I would imagine that must be very, very difficult for them.
Yeah, I I'm sorry, Mom. I know you're gonna listen to this, and I love you so much, and I'm sorry for the stress that I know this causes you. But at the same time, gosh, you're gonna get me teary here. My mom was the one who drove me to the airport. So we had my brother's graduation party Friday night, and we stayed up late and partied to celebrate him. He finished med school, and my mom drove me to the airport an hour away that morning, and I didn't know when I was gonna see her again. I knew it was going to be a long time, and I don't often go very long without seeing my mom. She's my best friend in this whole world. And so it was hard, and I could tell she wasn't enthused about me going into a place where bombs were dropping. But all she would say was she was dropping me off. And I think part of it was to stave off her own tears too, but all she would say, she repeated over and over again, "I'm so proud of you, I'm so proud of you, I'm so proud of you." Um, and so um it was really nice to have that encouragement. My whole family has been that way, my three brothers and my mom, my aunts, my uncles, my cousins, and they all understand why I'm doing it, right? And some of them have been even like, I wish I could be in your position to be able to help. And if you're Palestinian, especially in the diaspora, I think you totally that doesn't need explanation. But of course, they're terrified, right? The 2 weeks that I was here with my first trip, my stepdad was describing my mom, and she was like glued to her phone and just like freaking out at any bit of news. And it's just horrible, right? It's horrible for a mother to have to imagine that. And, again, I feel slightly bad for the worry that causes my mom, but I also know that it's not my fault, right? Israel could end every mother's worry if they would just stop dropping bombs, right? Because other Palestinian mothers, both in the West Bank in 48, but in this particular moment, mostly in Gaza, have to worry about their kids, have had to bury their kids, have been working in hospitals while their kids show up among the martyrs, right? And so, as much as my mom's pain matters to me, it's sort of just a piece of the pain that Palestinian parents, Palestinian mothers and parents feel on a daily basis, right? And I come here with a lot of privilege. I can coordinate my movement, I can deconflict and stuff. And so that's more privileged, and I have access, thankfully, to like food and sustenance, which is more than a lot of other people can say, right? And so there's still that I'm grateful for, and I know my mom is grateful for too, and my family.
Hmm. Yeah, thank you again for that. I was also a bit choked up while you were speaking because that's also a touching story, and um, yeah, I could imagine the perspective of both you and your mom and the rest of your family. So it's not easy. But I guess that leads into another question that I had for you, which is like your own sense of stress, because I would imagine that by virtue of you being there and helping, you are seen as some kind of interfering Western target for the IDF, because I know that they kill doctors, journalists, like thousands of people have been killed just trying to help people there. So I would guess that they don't take kindly to this. So what is it like for you to be there?
This is a tough question because I mean it's stressful, don't get me wrong, but it's stressful in a way that I think I'm not actually processing, right? I mean, there's constant, especially recently in the past like 3 weeks, I would say, ever since the Knesset voted and approved on sort of Operation Gideon's Chariot, which is this expansion of the Israeli military into the Gaza Strip and wanting to take control of 75% of the Gaza Strip. Ever since that was put in motion, the bombs have been pretty relentless and much closer than they previously have been in my experience here. And so that's stressful, right? Even if you get used to the sounds, which believe it or not, you do, right? Your body just adapts. Even if you get used to that and you don't kind of jump at the sound of bombs anymore, you still feel it in your body, right? And I'm sure it'll take a toll in some way, whether it shows up now or in the future. But it's it's really hard because it's like when the bombs hit, you're thinking to yourself like, "Fuck, who was murdered in that moment? Like, or whose house was destroyed? What entire family's memory and life story is no longer physically recognizable anymore? Whose bodies are no longer recognizable, like between the charred bones and flesh that is in that pile. Like that's the stressful part, right? Believe it or not, you don't. I'm sure maybe some people are, but I don't feel this fear of like, oh, I'm gonna die at any moment. That's not the fear. The fear is like, what next? Like who's next in this massacre that the Israelis have been carrying on for a year and a half, right? That's the stressful part. That's the part that hurts.
And have you seen, like, I would imagine you've been there long enough to have had a couple of close calls, or have a story of something that might open someone's eyes or communicate the daily struggle of people living under these circumstances. Do you have anything like that that you would want to share?
I mean, sure. I mean, I gotta say, I'm not necessarily convinced this is gonna change anybody's mind. I think if you, the content that Palestinian journalists and creators have put out, uh, is all the evidence that anybody will ever need, right? And if they were gonna change their minds, they would have by everything that Palestinians have said with their own voices. And by Palestinians, I mean, Ghazawiya, who were the people from here, whose homes we're talking about and whose lives we're talking about. But just to sort of answer your question, I mean, I've got all sorts of stories, right? Like, for example, I told you I came back in June 6th of 2024. And not 2, 3 days after my entry, I was taking a delegate who was a midwife that I entered with to the hospital, and we were doing the hospital tour and getting her acquainted and situated. And in the middle of the tour, on her first day in the hospital, we start hearing bombs like super close, right? And this is in Nusayrat camp, which is in the middle area. It was at the time the north and south were, the Israelis had closed Nitzarim corridor, which separated the north from the south. And so Nusayrat was like almost as north as you could go before hitting that Nitzarim corridor and the quote unquote red zone. And we just heard bomb after bomb after bomb, and it was like, what the hell is going on? I mean, obviously bombs are going off, but it wasn't like this. And then the doctors and hospital staff around me identified the sound of Apache helicopters and also particular quadcopters. I wasn't there long enough yet to be able to discern the types of fire like they were at the time. And so they were like, no, this is weird. The Apache and the quadcopter, along with the bombs, is not that there's something not atypical about this. Sure enough, we find out we're bunkered down now in the hospital, and people start coming in. And this is a private maternity hospital under normal circumstances. This is at Lauda Hospital at the time. And, injuries and deaths and martyrs just start coming in. And I mean, by like literally the carload, right? And it turns out we find out shortly after, we get a call from medical director in Canada of the organization, and he's like, "Hey, it turns out that Israeli special forces are in you guys' area, and they're retrieving some of the Israeli captives." And in that process, the Israelis, I believe, saved, I think it was three captives, and in the process killed nearly 300 Palestinians to do so. And that was a sight that was something I'd never seen in my life. I had gone to the base floor of the hospital because another NGO that we were bunking with had called for like translation help, I think, and there was a makeshift tent outside of this hospital that was being used as like the ICU because there just weren't enough beds. And I had seen people bringing in, uh, martyrs' bodies and on donkey carts, or they were like piling up injured and dead people together on blankets, on these just large sort of blankets, and four people were holding their corners and just walking them to the hospital, right? And you're talking about injuries, people's legs blown off, they're covered in blood, and there was no discrimination, age, gender. You're talking about tiny children, tiny babies to elderly. It was a sight that I don't think anybody would ever forget if they witnessed firsthand. And that was just a few days in, right? And there was no warning to the Israelis claim to like sort of give you warning of evacuation notice or whatever, and that's true sometimes, but there was no warning. We were there as an international NGO. There was another international NGO present at that hospital. No notice was given to the hospital or to us as international aid workers. So there's an example of that, but there's also another example that's less, how do I put this? That's less chaotic, but was just as memorable for me for some reason. So the roads in Gaza have become kind of non-existent now, right? Either the roads have been bulldozed intentionally by the IOF when they were operating in the area, or they've just been bombed to smithereens and they're full of debris, and a year and a half of not being able to actually take care of them. All of this compounded together makes roads really inaccessible, and oftentimes we're taking alternate routes to places because either roads are so inaccessible or they're inaccessible by virtue of the fact that they're in quote unquote red zones. And so we were driving in this like really sandy road that wasn't really a road. And it was really hot. It was the middle of July or August, maybe. And I mean, it was brutally hot outside. And the humidity here also adds in a way that just, you start sweating the second the sun starts really shining. So about like 9, 10 a.m., you just start feeling warm up until the sun sets. There's a bit of reprieve. And there was this little boy. And the road that we were driving down, just so you can get a really good visual, is kind of like in between two like kind of sand dunes. So there's like tents pitched on the top of the sand dunes, if you can imagine, where people were just displaced and finding anywhere to make a place to live. And so they had kind of pitched tents or put together these tarps and made it a tent. And while we were driving on that road, I saw this little boy trying to go upwards, uphill on this little sand dune, and he was carrying what looked like a gallon and a half, 2 gallon bucket of water. And it's not uncommon for children now to have to go to water stations for their family. It's like one of their daily tasks to go to their nearest water station, which may not be very close at all, and fill fresh water, drinking water, cooking water for their families. And this boy, Danny, couldn't have been more than more than 7 years old, and he was wearing these dirty, tattered clothes. He was super tan from just not having any cover from the sun. And this child was hauling this giant jug of water that was about his size, and he was trying to drag it in the sand. And I remember driving by in a car and seeing him, and he just kind of sat to take a break because he was just tired. And he was taking a break in the glaring sun. And at one point, he tried to like lift the water bottle to take a drink out of it because he was so thirsty, and he couldn't because it was just too heavy. So he like got himself on the ground to tip it over into his mouth and just kind of spilled a pretty good amount. And I can imagine how frustrating that is, like having gone to the water station and having to go through all of this just to get bare minimum fucking water supply for your family, and then spilling some of it while you're trying to take a drink. And this is not a burden that any human being should have to bear. But can you imagine doing that as a small child? And I couldn't help myself. I was in the car with other Palestinians, and I try not to like cry in front of other people here because I don't want them to have to like go through the sort of emotional effort of comforting me, right? Because they they shouldn't have to do that, right? But I couldn't hold that one in because I couldn't imagine being that child and having to do that. And again, it's such a small thing compared to like it's not this sort of like bloody death or anything like that, which is also happening. But also this is just this boy's everyday, right? And I don't even know if he's alive anymore. This was almost a year ago. But I think about that kid a lot. And I think that's just another one of the sort of less sensational points that doesn't make headlines, that isn't talked about either, right? Like what's gonna happen to that kid in 10 years if he makes it out of this alive? How do you explain like justice and fairness and love and community as a concept to a child that had to endure that, right? I don't know.
Both of those stories are absolutely terrible. I don't even have words to say anything in response to them. Just I think you raise a good point that all of this carnage and mayhem and death and destruction, if the aim is, as Israel says it is to make Israel safer, I I cannot imagine how that could be the outcome when you to inflict such trauma on a people for so long and with such intensity and with such cruelty and inhumanity. I can't imagine what life will be like for this I mean, what's the number? It's something like children in Gaza right now are the largest cohort of child amputees in history. So
Right,
the
right.
level of disability that people are going to be dealing with, not just physical, but as you're describing here, the emotional, the spiritual damage that's being wrought on people it's unfathomable, really.
And it's crazy because I remember even prior to October 2023, when Gazan children and the population of Gaza had already endured so much assault from the state of Israel that a Palestinian psychologist went out and said there is no such thing as post-traumatic stress disorder for the children of Gaza because there is no post in their trauma, right? It's constantly enduring. And this is before October 2023. And the way that people describe life here before October 2023 in comparison to what they're experiencing now is like a heaven, right? And so I don't know. I don't know if there's been an example of this in history where there's been like this totally preventable disaster and violence, and being able to see how children come out of that, if at all, right? Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I remember. I think that was Gabor Mate who said that. It was in a documentary that was released before. It was called "Where Olive Trees Weep,"
Hmm.
and he was interviewing people, and he was saying that, and it was very chilling to hear him say this because it resonated with me a lot while watching the documentary. That yeah, there is no post. It's just a constant barrage, a constant onslaught of cruelty and genocide and war and death. And yeah,
Mm.
yeah. I mean, I remember a time when this happened in the past and the world united to stop it. Now we watch it on our phones. It's the most televised genocide in history.
Mhm.
And we still debate with people as to whether or not it's even a genocide. And this is so mind boggling to me.
Yeah, yeah. I don't even know how to entertain that perspective anymore. Anybody who tries to suggest that this isn't a genocide is just willfully ignorant, and a willful participant in Zionism. And I hope that one day, if there's justice, they're held accountable for that.
Yeah. I I want to pivot a little bit because I I don't want to get so down in my emotional at the bottom of my emotional register and kind of get stuck there and not be able to continue speaking with you. I know that you have an interest in anthropology and like oral traditions. Is this correct?
Yes, yes, it is. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about that and what your experience has been like while you've been there. Have you been able to delve into that a little bit and connect with some of the those traditions and stories and maybe myths or things that you wouldn't have had access to had you not been there?
Oh yeah, totally. One of the privileges of being here is that you get to meet wonderful people, right? There is this not only like the folks behind Shabab Gaza, but just ordinary community members too, right? There is this wonderful woman known as Nasim, and she prior to the genocide, she was in East Khan Yunis, which is in the southern area of the Strip, and she was known for just like her cooking. And she was this older woman. Her husband had passed several years before, and whenever there were like outside guests to Khan Yunis, because a lot of people go to Gaza City, right? Like that's kind of like the most urban destination. And Khan Yunis is like this more rural, conservative area that a lot of outsiders don't necessarily like immediately go to. So when they do, the community kind of takes them to Nasim, and they'll make sure that they get like traditional Palestinian foods. One of my things, I think, combining like the tradition of oral history and ethnography with my love of food was that I've been trying to like document a lot of food practices, right? And people are super creative here, right? Like even out of the most basic bare ingredients, they make some of the best food that I've ever had in my life, right? And trying to document some of those recipes and see and this just sort of food traditions too, like the culture around the recipe, because Palestinian food isn't just about the food. The process itself is a testament to the culture and vice versa. And by that I mean you can't produce a Palestinian dish by yourself. It doesn't turn out the same, right? And it's not meant to be produced by a person single-handedly because it's a lot of work. And so trying to talk about these memories and experiences with people, mostly a lot of elders, right? Because they have some of the most traditional like forms of these stories and experiences, and sort of recording that in any way that I can. Trying to talk to people just kind of about their lives and who they were as people too is one thing, right? Because a lot of people forget themselves. It's really not up to them, but they've been turned into something else. Their lives have been forced into something else by Israel's onslaught. And so, documenting their experiences of who they were before this genocide began is important, I think, in understanding Palestinian history in general, but also for the people here, I think, right? Because when you grow up Palestinian, you grow up hearing this myth constantly thrown at you that there was no such thing as Palestine, right? Like Jewish settlers came to this land and it was just this barren desert that didn't have a culture and didn't have a people. And so it's like absurd when you talk to Palestinians to even consider that true, because the information that you get through our traditions is passed down from generation to generation, right? And these are the stories, these are the living embodiments that counter these kind of very stupid basic myths. And it's not just food, right? Like wedding traditions. I love documenting the way that these traditions are different here in Gaza than they are in my hometown in the West Bank, which is near Ramallah, right? And part of me looks at these and is like, okay, how much of the differences are driven by Israel's colonization and subsequent blockade of Gaza in particular, but Palestine in general, and how much of them are just like different traditions by different villages? That's a really interesting question to try to gauge. And it's a privilege to be able to mull these thoughts over, right? But I do nonetheless find them kind of interesting.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. As you were talking, I was kind of just marveling at you as a person, and I was catching myself getting a little distracted that there's someone like you there, selflessly volunteering their time, risking life and limb, and finding beauty in these little cracks, and getting caught up with people's stories and learning about food and asking yourself these questions and being there. And to me, and speaking to you, you sound so full of vitality and life, and just like this force for light and love and hope in a place. And yeah, I just wanted to share that with you because it was really coming up in me, and it's special what you're doing, I think. So I just wanted to share that with you.
That's really kind. Thank you. I gotta say again though, it's that's Palestine. That's the Palestinian in me that does that, right?
Mm.
And I think it's true because there's nothing beautiful about like streets of demolished houses, right? Like that's the landscape here. I don't think people can fathom the level of destruction. Like the roads are made just by like clearing the rubble of what were once shops and houses and centers and I don't know, football courts or whatever they are. And so there's nothing visually pretty in Gaza anymore because of the Israelis except for the beach, right? But what is beautiful and what Zionism and Israel will never ever take away, and I think this is what makes Zionists so angry, is that you'll never actually be able to remove the beauty from Palestine because it lives on through people no matter where they are, right? Even if they've been evacuated or escaped to like Egypt or wherever, your love of this place and the culture here, and I don't mean that in an abstract way at all, but of the traditions, of the foods, of the community, they go with you wherever you are, and they can't leave you because that's who you are, and it really is inherently beautiful. And I don't mean that in a romanticized way at all, right? There are obviously problems like any community has, right? If you want to sort of conceptualize it, turn it into gender and questions like that, sure, those all exist. But Palestinian culture is beautiful by virtue of the people that choose over and over again to celebrate it and preserve it and live it in a way that keeps it alive despite every force that's trying to ensure that it doesn't live.
I love that. That was very beautifully articulated. And yes, yes, thank you for sharing that. I know we're coming up towards time now, and I wanted to give you some space to talk about how people can support you, where people could find you, what people could do if they want to help, beyond things like general advocacy or boycotting or raising awareness, donating. Are there other things that come to mind? And I just want to give you some space to talk about that kind of stuff towards the end here.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's a really hard question to answer, because people have advocated, they've petitioned to their representatives and feel like that hasn't worked. People have hit the streets and protest and feel like that hasn't worked. And people have donated and they're still suffering, right? Change at this kind of structural level is always going to be slow, right? So I think the best advice that I can give people is keep doing what you're doing in terms of all of these things, right? Targeted boycotts. There is the sort of the official boycott, divestment, and sanctions a movement that has very specific targeted boycotts, and I think that's the most effective way to go about boycotts. It's really easy to get discouraged at any turn, and I would really encourage people not to. Israel has only responded recently, for example, to like aid entry, even after the GHF thing failed, because of international pressure, right? And that
Hmm.
comes from the grassroots level. That's always going to be true. And so, no matter how like minuscule you might feel or totally ineffective you might feel your move is, it resonates, right? It may take time, it will take time, but it's worth it. These people, this place, um, is worth it. What history will say about it down the line is going to be worth it, right? And so, yeah, I wish I had something more concrete to say, but I also think that like pursuing international solidarity, genuinely seeing the connections between Palestine and other places, right? These sort of forced deportations and ICE, for example, in the U.S. of immigrant communities is not at all different from the separation of Palestinian families and the unlawful detention of like Palestinian children, for example, by the Israeli military. That's the same thing. The murder of Black people in the United States and mostly in the United States and other places too is not any different than an Arab kid getting killed by the Israeli Shin Bet in 48, and that kid not ever seeing justice, right? Or his family not ever seeing justice for his death. So realizing that, I think, will like give us the strength and community that we need to get through the times that are particularly hard like this one. And that may sound really like lovey-dovey and stuff, but I genuinely think that's true, right? I really do. I think if we understand that in a way, and not just like other people understanding this, their struggles are connected to Palestine, but Palestinian Americans in the or Palestinians in the diaspora anywhere also understanding that their struggle is connected to other marginalized people, wherever they are, even if they're in a relatively privileged position as Palestinians, wherever they might be. So I genuinely mean that. I think establishing like international solidarity and understanding those connections is fundamental, towards any modicum of justice. Because Palestine is not an isolated struggle, and it never will be. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's that. As far as where people can find me, my Instagram page is private. I'm not a big Instagram person, I gotta say. But if you want updates and stuff on the work that I'm doing, follow my pop-up page. I've kind of turned that into like a an information post of sort of like what I'm doing here sometimes. But I'd also follow Shabab Gaza. Their Instagram is just that. It's SHABAB, and then Gaza. And then I'd also follow Glia, which is Glia underscore INTL for Glia International. And then, look, at the end of the day, I'm not going to ever say anything that is more important or better said than any other Gazan on the ground. So please do follow people from here. Despite the fact that Israel has killed more journalists in this particular genocide than any other conflict in recent history, there are still Palestinian journalists on the ground doing work. And for information, I would always go to them first.
Thank you for sharing all of that, and it resonated a lot with me because what you were saying about everything being connected there and what's happening in Gaza is happening everywhere. I mean, spirituality is a pretty important topic for me on this podcast, and if we are all connected, not just to each other but to this planet and to the more than human world, then what happens there is happening to us, and it's important that we care for one another and try to do what we can to stand up against these things. So I'm really grateful for you to being here and for you sharing that and for everything you've shared and the work that you do and just who you are and the stories you shared and everything. So I want to thank you again for passing through with me today. And yeah, it was great to talk to you and help share your story.
I appreciate it, Danny. It really has been a great pleasure to talk to you, and I'm grateful for the questions that you asked, and to be able to do this kind of interview with somebody that already has like that baseline understanding has been a relief. So thanks for the opportunity, and thanks for the work you're doing as well.
Thank you for passing through today. Yeah, you, dear listener. Thank you for your support, for your attention, for spending some time with me and this episode's guest. If you're enjoying this content, please subscribe, rate it, like it, tell your friends about it. Your support really does mean a lot to me, so thank you for listening, and I will talk to you next time.